There are silences that arrive louder than any voice. This one came in the form of 14 words flat on a screen without punctuation. Audrey, do not come to my military retirement ceremony. It's not appropriate. I read the line twice then again. My hands stonied where they were, resting lightly on the edge of the personnel transfer forms I'd been reviewing. Nothing in the room moved. Not the overhead fan, not the coffee stain dried to the corner of the binder, not even the pen that had been rolling gently along the slope of my desk. Everything held still, as if waiting to see how I would absorb the blow. I typed only one word in reply, understood. There were no follow-ups, no second thoughts, not even the pretense of a softened landing. I closed the email client and turned back to the personnel files, but the words hung in the air longer than any name on the page. My father, Colonel Richard Callahan, had managed to erase me from the single event that would enshrine his legacy, and he'd done it with so. A part of me waited to feel something sharp or loud. Nothing came. Only the steady awareness that this had been coming for years, just dressed differently each time. The missing name in the family Christmas photo caption, the silence after my first deployment, the time he stood in my promotion ceremony crowd like a bystander, arms crossed watching the flag, but not me. It would have been easier if he shouted. Instead, he preferred the clean cut of phrases like, "We didn't think it was your kind of event," or, once when I'd asked to be included in a pub, "You know the optics wouldn't make sense." I'd never asked what kind of optics made a decorated logistics officer look inconvenient. I already knew. After lunch, I pulled up the Callahan Veterans Foundation website. The banner image loaded slowly smiling men in uniform, shovels in hand, standing before a half-built woozing unit. Third from the left, Thomas, my brother, in a pressed polo and clean boots. I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't in the donor credits. And when I scrolled to the board of advisors, my name, once listed as a founding consultant, was gone. Gone like it had never mattered. Gone like the signature on the loan documents I'd co-signed 3 years earlier didn't hold up the expansion project they now called the organization's greatest success. I minimized the screen, looked down at my hands. The left still wore the dull ring from the class of '09 Army Logistics, Fort Lee. The metal was worn smooth, but I kept it because it never tried to mean more than it was. I thought of calling my mother, but I already knew how that would go. She would lower her voice and say, "Your father's under a lot of pressure. He didn't mean it like that." She always said that. About the missed birthdays, the forgotten award dinners, the time he referred to my rank as ceremonial. I remembered a moment from 2 years ago, standing beside him at a dinner event for donors. Someone had asked who I was. He'd laughed and replied, "That's Audrey. She's the quiet one. Not the soldier, not the officer, just quiet," as if being forgettable was the only thing I had managed to be consistently. It was hard to explain to people how a person could erase you without ever raising their voice. He didn't need to shout. He had paperwork, public relations, family brunches where my name was left off the place cards. My presence was always temporary, conditional, like I was a favor someone did once and regretted. After work, I sat at the end of my bed and opened the wooden box where I kept old documents. The loan agreement was still there, neatly folded, signed with my full legal name. Above it, an email printed from years ago. "Audrey, we need a secondary signatory with solid federal credit history. It's just a formality. You won't be responsible for anything. Thank you for doing this. The foundation means something because of sacrifices like yours." Dad. I hadn't looked at that email since the week it arrived. I remembered rereading it then, too, but with a different kind of ache. One that still believed this was how connection worked in my family, through silent obligation. I returned everything to the box and placed it back on the shelf. Some people get banished with slamming doors. Others just wake up one day and realize their key was changed without notice. I didn't tell anyone at the base, didn't mention the email or the ceremony or the foundation. When someone asked me if I had plans to attend the colonel's retirement, I said, I wasn't invited. They looked startled. I liked that part, the silence that told me they didn't know what to say. For once, it matched mine. The next morning, I wore my pressed uniform and reviewed logistics numbers like I always did. I kept my answers brief in meetings. I skipped the group lunch and walked instead slow steps through the gravel lot behind in the main building. The sun was bright but not warm. My boots left shallow prints I didn't bother to turn back and study. There were no arguments, no letters sent, no door slammed shut behind me, just a clean, careful line drawn in an email. 14 words, no punctuation. And me choosing not to answer again. Some efforts become habits long after they've stopped being hopeful. I used to fold my uniform tighter than regulation before visiting home. The creases didn't matter there, not really. My father noticed only if they weren't sharp. Once as I stepped through the front door, he looked up briefly and said, "Your collar's weak," before returning to his newspaper. He never asked where I'd been stationed, never mentioned the commendations that showed up in quarterly bulletins. I stopped bringing them up. I stopped expecting the look that Thomas always got, shoulders squeezed, a glass lifted halfway in pride. The first time I wore my service blues to dinner, my mother paused in the doorway and adjusted her earrings. Maybe something softer next time, she said, eyes flicking down. You know how your uncle reacts to too much presence. So, I wore grey after that. A cardigan and slacks. Easier to blend, easier to forget. The cottontail pin, small, dull, shaped like a soldier's cuff button, used to sit inside my left pocket, just above the seam. He gave it to me before I left for Fort Lee. It came with no speech, just a nod. "This one's from mine," he said and turned away. I kept it, not because it meant anything, but because I wanted it to. During family fundraisers, I'd stand near the back, just inside the rented pavilion tent. If someone asked who I was, my mother would smile too quickly. She's the detail person. Keeps track of things. I nodded. I didn't say I'd spent 6 months rebuilding an emergency logistics plan that saved a field unit from collapsing under the blackout conditions. That I had soldiers who followed my orders, like they mattered. That I had rank. It never reached the tent. When the expansion loan came up, I was at Fort Sill back on base after a 16-hour joint exercise. He called without preamble. "We've got a funding bottleneck." Paperwork nonsense. I need a name with a clean federal line. Just for show. I asked him if the project was already approved. "It will be." "This just smooths the road." He used phrases like that, often just for optics, only on paper, not a burden. Then he added, "Family helps without noise." I didn't say no. A week later, a manila envelope arrived by FedEx. The contract had 2 tabs marked in blue. I signed where the tabs told me to. At Thanksgiving that year, Thomas stood and toasted the resilience of family. The table clapped. I cleared the dishes. No one mentioned the loan. No one needed to. Once during a board meeting held in our family's sunroom, I was asked to bring out extra coffee cups. As I passed them around, a man in a suit I didn't know turned to my father. "She's military, right? Logistics." My father didn't hesitate. "She likes to stay busy." I remember standing behind his chair, holding the carafe in one hand, a ring of heat pressed into my palm. He didn't look up. The man smiled at me politely, then looked away. There were moments when I almost said something. Not to accuse, just to exist more fully in the room. Like the evening after Thomas got quoted in a trade magazine. My father printed the article, folded it neatly, and left it on the mantel. I'd been published too an internal piece on tactical transitions, but it stayed in the inbox of my commanding officer. Or the morning after I completed my 3rd deployment cycle. My mother offered coffee and a quiet note. Let's not mention work too much today. Your brother's going through a tough quarter. I didn't argue. I put the coffee in a thermal flask and sat on the porch until the wind picked up. Sometimes I'd run my thumb over the edge of the button pin in my pocket, tracing the indentation like a path back towards something that might count as recognition. But it stayed quiet. Like everything else. At one point, I received a formal invitation to a foundation gala. My name was printed on the envelope, but inside the RSVP card listed me only as +1. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it fit so precisely. During that evening, Thomas took the microphone to announce a new strategic direction. We were refining our vision, he said, focusing on forward-facing partnerships. I stood near the exit coat folded over one arm. When the applause died down, my father shook hands with donors leaned in close to familiar faces nodded with weight. He caught my eye across the room once and offered the faintest expression, neither a smile nor a frown, just enough movement to acknowledge geography, not connection. Later, he told me, "You do your part quietly. That's what makes it work." I nodded then too. I still carried the envelope from the loan agreement in a drawer near my desk. Not because I needed it, but because something about the way my name looked in ink under his reminded me of the difference between inclusion and use. I never asked to be praised. I only wanted to be visible. Some people mistake silence for grace. I used to. Now I just see where it leaves dust. Some absences become sharp over time, not because they were dramatic when they happened, but because they never stopped happening. I kept the 18th birthday card longer than I meant to. The envelope said, "To Thomas and family," though I was the one turning 18 that week. My name wasn't inside, not even in a side note. When I brought it up quietly, not accusingly, my mother didn't blink. "They must have bundled yours with his. You know how your father does things efficiently." I waited another year before throwing it away. It never felt like mine. My first commendation was from a training rotation abroad, a small rectangular medal pinned after 3 grueling weeks in a joint logistics unit. I sent a photo home, crisp uniform, slight tilt of pride. Days passed, then one voicemail. "Just don't let this distract you from starting a real life. These things pass." I replayed that line once while packing for deployment, as if repetition might reveal a layer I'd missed. Later, when I received the offer to work under a civilian-military joint task force, I forwarded the appointment letter. The reply came as a one-line message. "It's still an admin job. Don't make it into a parade." It wasn't the words. It was how they closed every sentence with a period like a door shutting before I entered. The most lasting cuts came without noise. During a family dinner, someone asked where I was stationed that year. Before I could speak, my father lifted his glass. "Thomas is running point on multiple fronts. Audrey, she's always had good instincts." There were nods around the table. I held my fork, didn't lift it. Good instincts, the kind of praise that never gets anyone promoted. Afterward, Thomas leaned over while we cleared plates. He doesn't mean harm. It's just he sees himself in me more. I nodded. I didn't remember asking for resemblance. I once offered edits to the Foundation's public statement. I'd taken policy writing courses. I'd reviewed communication drafts for active military channels. My suggestions were returned with a yellow sticky note. Reads too formal. Try less bureaucratic. The press release went out with near identical language. No credit. Not even a thanks. A few months later, at a fundraising dinner, I arrived on time and helped set the place cards. My name tag read Logistics Assistant. I turned it over. No correction on the other side. I mentioned it briefly to the event manager. She glanced toward my father. He prefers simpler titles, keeps the focus on the cause. That same night, my father told a guest, Audrey always supports from the edges. Steady hands, not spotlight. I still had the program from that event, creased at the fold, ink bleeding slightly from the printer. I circled his words in pencil, then folded it back into my drawer. During one winter break, I joined a photo shoot for the Foundation's annual report. I wore my uniform, pressed respectful. The others came in sweaters and neutral tones. My father looked at me once, not harshly, just long enough. We're aiming for approachability. Military dress sometimes intimidates the donors. I stood off camera. Afterward, my mother smoothed my sleeve and whispered, maybe next time, something less structured. It wasn't a rebuke. It was something colder, suggestion, as dismissal. The office wall behind my father's desk held a large photograph of the family. Everyone was in it. Thomas and his wife, the Foundation board, even our neighbor who'd once volunteered at the Thanksgiving drive. I wasn't in the frame. I checked 3 times. When I asked gently if they had another print, he answered without pause. We just used the best composition. It wasn't personal. But the omissions added, like chalk marks on a wall you weren't supposed to touch. At one meeting after a long presentation, I'd helped revise, my father concluded. Let's keep her in the loop. Audrey brings balance. Balance. Like a paperweight. One evening, Thomas shared an anecdote during dinner about a grant proposal. My mother turned toward me and said, You're more grounded, though. Not everyone's meant to lead. No one looked up. The comment settled like dust across the table. I never argued. Not once. Not out loud. I wore my uniform correctly. I sent updates only when necessary. I responded to Foundation emails with brevity, deference. I returned home when asked. I stayed silent when thanked in passing, as if I'd been included though never present. There was a glass case, once small walnut frame, where my father kept artifacts. Thomas's varsity pin, a photograph from their father-son, hiked the ribbon from the first Foundation gala. Nothing of mine. One night I placed a folded, pocket-sized medal citation card inside, just behind the glass. 2 days later, it was gone. No one mentioned it. I carried the citation back to base, pressed it flat beneath a field-lead manual. It stayed there for years, unread. I used to keep a brass button in my uniforms in a pocket. My father had given it to me when I graduated from West Point. A small piece of tradition, he'd said, closing my hand around it. I kept it through 3 postings and a storm evacuation. One day I reached for it without thinking. It felt cold, metallic, without weight. I didn't put it back. Some things aren't removed all at once. They're thinned, pared down, until even memory can't dress them up. And yet I remember all of it. Even now I still glance at photos expecting to find my own face. I don't know why. Some betrayals aren't loud. They sit quietly inside folders. I kept a printed copy of the loan agreement I'd co-signed for my father. It was folded once vertically, the way he liked his documents handled. The top right corner was bent, and my name sat neatly beside his. Just one loan, one signature. That had been the agreement. I only looked again because the numbers didn't match the bank statements. The original loan I agreed to was listed as 1.2 million startup capital for the veteran outreach expansion. The project, my father said, would honor the legacy. But the account reflected 3 separate draws, and the total balance due had crept near 5 million. The call to Emily wasn't planned. She had handled a property transfer for me 2 years ago. Clean, professional, direct. I emailed her the loan documents just to check. She called back later that week. Her voice didn't rise. Audrey, there are 2 other commercial notes filed under your name. Different dates, different amounts. One is dated July 14th, 2021. I didn't speak. That date I had been deployed on joint NATO exercises. 6 weeks offshore. I cross-checked the travel records. You weren't in the country, and the signature looks replicated. Same pen pressure, same angle. No variance. She paused before the next part. One of them is for 3.8 million. I didn't ask who filed it. A week later, I received a thick envelope. No return address. Inside copies of notarized agreements, asset guarantees, and wire confirmations. The same signature mine appeared on every document. Each was clean. No strike-throughs. No indication of hesitation. No record of review. On one, the initials were even placed in a corner I'd never use. A subtle giveaway. The final page of the last file showed a notarization date matching a live training session I had run in Italy. Timestamp documented. Public. A yellow sticky note was tucked behind the flap. No name. Just handwriting. You didn't deserve this. I placed the stack on the kitchen table. No coffee this time. Just water. I held the glass for a long while, not because I was thirsty, but because it gave me something to do with my hands. When I called the foundation office, they routed me to my father's assistant. He's in a board meeting. I can let him know you called. No need, I answered. Later that evening, my mother sent a text. Your father says you're misunderstanding the numbers. He suggests you stop before this gets embarrassing. No explanation. No denial. Just a request to retreat. I didn't respond. The next day, my father's voice echoed through a voicemail. Audrey family doesn't use lawyers. That's how we lose trust. If something looks off, bring it to me. Quietly. He paused before adding, You wouldn't want people thinking you're trying to damage the family's work. I didn't save the message. At one point, Thomas called cheerful as ever. Hey, I heard you're poking around. You always get caught in the weeds, sis. Let the team handle the big picture stuff. He laughed softly, then added, Dad's already dealt with the structure. No one's trying to screw you over. But he never said I had signed. My inbox remained empty of clarification. There had been signs. A signature request forwarded by mistake to my military email, then immediately recalled. A credit inquiry I brushed off as a system error. A tax form referencing a distribution I'd never received. I'd assumed bureaucracy, misfiling, maybe sloppiness. I hadn't considered theft. I went back to the words my father used when I first signed the original loan. We don't need outside counsel. Family supports family in silence. Now I understood. Dylan meant blindness. Blindness meant access. I'd offered a key. They had duplicated it. I opened the drawer beside my desk, where I used to keep mementos. Field notes, campaign coins, a folded flag from my first assignment. I placed the fake contracts inside, beside a scratched dog tag that no longer hung from my gear. The pen I had used to sign the original loan was missing its cap. It had bled ink onto the edge of my journal, staining 2 words, trusted source. I traced them once with my finger before closing the cover. I didn't make a scene. I didn't confront anyone at the house. There was no explosion, no courtroom. Just an ache between the ribs and a silence I could no longer explain away. At dinner the following Sunday, my mother asked if I had reconsidered attending the gala. We need a calm face, not one holding grudges. I didn't answer. Thomas passed the bread, his eyes avoiding mine. My father refilled his glass and spoke to no one in particular. Some people see betrayal in every disagreement. That's not leadership. That's weakness. He chewed slowly as if savoring something earned. The wine in my glass stayed untouched. The napkin on my lap stayed folded, never used. I looked at the polished silverware, the reflection warped and partial. In it, I saw my own hands, but never my face. Some decisions don't make a sound when they're made. I folded the Callahan crest in a soft cloth and left it in the top drawer of my travel chest. It had been stitched onto every deployment case since the academy. Gold thread, navy edge, 3 stitched stars. I never thought to question why it mattered, until now, when it no longer did. Emily filed the revocation paperwork without asking for a meeting. She sent the standard notification to the foundation, requested replacement collateral for the remaining loan balance, and marked the documents with a note. Client withdrawing guarantee privileges effective immediately. No fanfare, just ink and legal language. 2 days later, my mother's name lit up the screen. Your father's not well. This wasn't necessary. There was no follow-up sentence, only dots hanging in the message like a quiet reprimand. I read it twice, deleted it, then turned the phone off. The apartment lease had already been signed. It sat in a neat folder beside my passport, my DD2 Forsord, and a list of items I no longer wanted to carry. I didn't take the large paintings or the walnut desk, just a framed photograph of Arlington's sunrise, an old tea kettle, and the coat I wore during my final briefing. The lining was frayed near the sleeve, but the seams still held. I emailed the board my formal resignation as military liaison. No press release, no replacement suggested. I used the plain signature block, no titles, no rank. The auto reply from the foundation came within minutes. Thank you for your service. Your contribution will be remembered. I didn't check if they meant it. At the storage unit, I labelled each box with a black marker. Some labels were practical winter gearbooks. Others felt like summaries awards. I never displayed gifts from people I no longer speak to, letters that stopped mattering. The last one I marked simply, keep. Quietly. Thomas left a voicemail that evening. I listened once. You've embarrassed Dad. You think this is noble. It's petty. You should have talked to us like family. There was a long pause. You're not special, Audrey. You just don't know how to be part of something bigger. He hung up. I replayed the words, not because I needed to hear them again, but because something about the tone reminded me of childhood recitals. Perfect posture, practiced lines, no room for improvisation. At dinner, once years ago, I had dropped a glass. It shattered across the table, and everyone turned to look not at the shards, but at me. My father's voice was calm then too. Audrey's always been delicate. That night, I swept up the glass myself. No one moved. The building I chose was quiet, 3 floors, no gate. The apartment overlooked a small park. No one greeted me when I moved in. That suited me. I didn't leave a forwarding address. The elevator key was slightly loose in its slot. It clicked faintly when turned like an old lock, unsure of its duty. That sound stayed with me longer than I expected. On the second night, Emily called to confirm the documents had been received by all relevant parties. There were no legal challenges, no threats. Just a final message from the Foundation's legal counsel. We regret this outcome, but accept Ms. Bennett's decision to sever financial association. That was the phrase, sever financial association. Cold, clean, satisfying. The Callahan name had been on every board letterhead I'd seen since I was a child. Sometimes printed in bold, sometimes watermarked, sometimes embossed in gold foil at the bottom of annual reviews. I used to think it meant belonging. I don't anymore. At a family brunch months ago, my mother handed me a card meant for Thomas and his wife. The envelope had no name on it. I passed it back to her. She looked surprised. Oh, she blinked. I thought it never mind. Then she turned and kept talking to someone else. There's a kind of forgetting that happens slowly, like ink fading under sunlight. At first the outline remains, then only shadows. Then nothing at all. I didn't announce my departure. There was no confrontation, no explanation, no permission asked, just boxes sealed, contracts nullified, lines drawn. I boiled water the following morning and poured it into the old kettle, the one I kept from overseas. It hissed, soft and steady. Steam rose against the narrow window, leaving a temporary fog that faded as quickly as it came. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't scroll through messages. I didn't reach for the picture frames I hadn't unpacked. Instead, I sat in the one chair I brought with me, drank tea without sugar, and folded the lease agreement once vertically. Some ties aren't cut with scissors. They are undone quietly by hands that no longer tighten the knot. The silence wasn't loud. It just stayed. I kept the curtains half open during the day, not for the light, but for the sense of motion beyond the glass, cars pulling in, a delivery truck idling, someone unlocking a bike with gloved hands. The world moved without asking who I used to be. The kitchen had one overhead light that flickered on a delay. I didn't fix it. It became part of the routine. Flip the switch. Wait, listen. The hiss of the kettle came next, then the soft clink of the chipped ceramic mug I'd brought with me. Not because it was valuable, but because it had survived long enough to feel real. Each morning started the same way. I ran the block 3 times, not far, just enough to hear my breath steady. Then I returned, made coffee, and opened the daily briefing Emily forwarded from the transition team. I scanned the logistics reports, marked notes where needed, and sent back the required numbers. It wasn't glamorous work routing civilian shipments, confirming surplus usage, but it was clean. No blurred lines, no family names. Around noon I wiped the counter and folded laundry. I found comfort in tasks that ended without discussion. The new desk sat by the window. No plaques. No commendations. Just a legal pad, 2 pens and a small clay figurine someone once gave me as a joke during field orientation. It resembled a fox, maybe a dog, depending on the light. I never liked journaling, but I started writing anyway. 1 line a day, repaired the cabinet hinge, called utilities without needing a reminder, read 20 pages without checking my phone. Small things. I didn't mention anyone's name. Not Thomas, not my mother, not the board or my father. Just actions dated and true. In the evening I wiped down the stovetop, even when it wasn't dirty. I rearranged the bookshelf twice in the first week. I listened to one podcast about budgeting. Then another about growing herbs on apartment balconies. I didn't plan to garden, but the idea stayed with me longer than expected. The mail came irregularly, mostly catalogues addressed to the previous tenant, and one handwritten envelope with no return name. Inside was a card that read, "Wishing you peace." That was it. No signature, no clue. I placed it in the drawer with the lease. I didn't reply to texts, not to Thomas's abrupt, "Is this really how you want it?" Not to my mother's, "You've made your point, Audrey." Not even to the foundation assistant who wrote, "We would still welcome your insight discreetly." I didn't erase the messages either. I just let them sit like dust I no longer wiped away. On the 11th day, the hallway neighbor knocked to borrow a screwdriver. His name was Ben, and he wore a maintenance tag from another building. I handed him mine. He nodded, thanked me, and left. No questions. No commentary. I marked that day's entry, loaned tool. Didn't explain anything. The air at night felt thinner than I remembered. I opened the window above the sink just enough to let in the dry, neutral scent of asphalt and cooling metal. There were no trees nearby, no grass patches, just the steady hum of cars pulling in and the soft click of doors closing. One evening, while sorting utility receipts, I noticed a thin grease stain shaped like a ring. It reminded me of the time I spilled dressing on a commander's agenda and thought it would end my field assignment. It didn't. He never mentioned it. He just handed me a clean copy the next morning and said, "Mistakes get absorbed. Just don't repeat them." That was the kindest anyone in leadership ever spoke to me. I wrote it down not to praise him, but to remind myself that kindness doesn't always come from those closest. Midway through the second week, a woman from the 3rd floor knocked on my door, holding a misdelivered package. It wasn't mine. She checked the label, blinked, then said, "Oh, you're not Ms. Callahan." "No," I replied. "I'm not." She smiled vaguely and walked away. I stood there, hand still on the knob, listening to her steps recede. There was something final in saying it aloud. By the 3rd week, I stopped checking the Foundation news updates. Their operations would continue without disruption. A new liaison had been named, someone from the academy, polished, well-liked, likely hand-picked. I didn't resent her. I just didn't care. That night, I placed the old ID badge in a sealed envelope and wrote "retired" across the front. Not submitted. Not processed. Just acknowledged. The notebook grew fatter. Paid rent early. Didn't correct the barista when she misspelled my name. Watched the neighbors laugh and didn't feel outside it. Outside the window, a little girl practiced riding a bicycle. Her mother stood a few feet behind, arms slightly raised, ready, but not rushing. The child wobbled twice, then steadied. I didn't have a memory like that. No one ran behind me. No one clapped when I found balance. But I didn't feel cheated watching it. Just still. Stillness isn't silence. Stillness is what you notice when everything loud has stopped pretending to care. I used to think silence meant absence, but now I know it can mean strategy. The call came during lunch. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Habit, not curiosity. Walter Green's voice broke through the static with manufactured calm. "Audrey, the board would appreciate a conversation regarding the recent loan restructuring. We think it would be wise to find a path forward that protects everyone involved." I placed the phone back on the counter before the sentence ended. The screen stayed lit for a moment, showing the call still active. Then it went black. That evening, a letter slid through my door's mail slot. Cream envelope. Familiar handwriting. Your father is distressed. The way this is playing out reflects poorly on us all. You should sit down with him before more damage is done. No signature. Just the looping end of my mother's S, like she was still writing from the kitchen table with a paperweight pressed to the corner. I folded the letter twice, not out of respect, just to fit it into the small drawer where I kept loose coupons and appliance manuals. By morning, the email had arrived. Audrey, you've made your point, but the press is getting wind of the withdrawals. Investors are pulling out. You know what this means. Maybe consider retracting before it gets irreversible, Thomas. No greeting, no warmth, no question about my well-being. Just metrics and consequence. I didn't reply right away. I made tea in the old chipped kettle and stared at the slow whirl of steam rising. I wore a cardigan with the missing button. It had always been too thin for proper winter wear, but too sentimental to discard. James once said it made me look grounded. He meant it kindly. I pulled up my email window and wrote one sentence. You more than anyone know what you signed in my name. Don't call again. Then I clicked send and logged out. They didn't come back for me. They came back for what I used to protect. The next week, Walter left a voicemail I didn't finish. A woman from the Foundation's PR firm emailed a draft statement in case you want to participate in shaping the narrative. I didn't open the attachment. I deleted it with the same motion I used to toss old napkins. My mother followed with another message. Don't turn this into a spectacle. What will people think? That line stayed longer than it should have. I read it 3 times. Not because I cared about her worry, but because it confirmed what I'd always suspected. For her, the truth was less important than appearances. Pain was inconvenient. Image everything. I made a list that night, not of grievances. Not of debts, just names. People who showed up only when signatures were missing. People who never remembered my birthday, but always remembered my security clearance. People who held wine glasses in one hand while pushing contracts with the other. I saved the document under a plain name. March notes. No password, no drama. Later, I opened the folder labeled Family Photos on my computer. Most were taken during ceremonies commissioning retirements, charity galas. I looked at my own face in those images. Always centered, always composed, but no longer familiar. I dragged the folder to the desktop, copied it to an external drive, and then deleted it from the laptop. Not because I wanted to erase them, but because they no longer deserved to be framed beside my work files and personal notes. I placed the drive in a locked box, same box where I kept the folded contract Emily had sent back with a sticky note. You were never legally bound after the first guarantee. No anger, just clarity. In the 3rd week of April, Thomas tried one more time. A text with no punctuation. Don't be like this, we can fix it before Dad gets involved again. I turned the phone over and set it on the table face down. That night I made soup from scratch. No recipe, just instinct and salt. I sat at the counter and listened to a podcast about the structure of trees, how rings fall under pressure. How you can tell a fire year from the thickness of the line. The host said something I wrote down. Resilience isn't visible in real time. You see it only in the aftermath. I underlined it twice. By the end of the week, I hadn't replied to anyone. The mailbox was empty. The phone had stopped ringing. The silence returned, but it felt different this time, less like a void, more like space I owned. I dusted the bookshelf, rearranged nothing, just moved my hand across the spines to feel the ridges. Then I opened the notebook and wrote, didn't respond, didn't explain, didn't break. Stillness again. And this time, it was mine. There's a difference between disappearing and choosing not to be found. The office was smaller than I'd expected. No glass walls, no polished floors, just a folding table with mismatched chairs and a dry erase board that still had ghosted writing from last week's meeting. But when I introduced myself, the woman in the navy sweater looked up and repeated my name back slowly, clearly, like it mattered. Audrey Bennett. Welcome. The folder she handed me had a post-it with a smiley face. No instructions, no chain of command. Just names of former service members needing logistics, placement, housing, contact lists, and handwritten notes in the margins. Someone had underlined call before Friday, sleeping in car. No one mentioned my clearance. No one brought up my father. I bought groceries after work. Real ones. Broccoli, garlic, lemons. I had to look up how to store them properly. The fridge made a low hum as I unpacked, like it was unsure of its new purpose. I lined the vegetables in a row, then stepped back and nodded once. There was a planter outside the window, half cracked and filled with old soil. I scooped it out with a measuring cup. My fingers smelled like earth and metal. At the nursery down the street, I chose a small lavender plant. Not the tallest, not the cheapest. Just one with thick stems and soft leaves that curled inward at the tips. I didn't name it. I just watered it. The email icon on my work laptop blinked once before settling. I changed the display photo that night. Removed the old one, me in uniform, flag blurred behind me, eyes too wide from the flash. I replaced it with a photo I took last spring, standing in filtered sunlight, hair loose a shadow of a grin. Starting, but not yet formed. No insignia. No backdrop. Just me. I made a budget on graph paper, not a spreadsheet. I wanted to see the ink, rent, groceries, transit, donation line. I added one more column at the bottom margin. Not for emergencies, not for guilt. Just something unnamed I might want later. The paperwork took longer than expected. Changing a legal name isn't complicated, but it isn't quick either. I filled in the form box by box, using a pen I'd taken from the reception desk, under reason. I didn't write anything dramatic, just one sentence. This is not erasure. This is return. Audrey Bennett. No hyphen, no maiden marker, just a name I chose to wear, not inherit. When the new ID arrived, I stared at it longer than necessary. The photo was a little blurry, and the lighting made my eyes look uneven. Still, I placed it in my wallet behind a bus pass and a folded receipt from the plant store. It fit. My mother texted twice. Both were short. Don't overcomplicate things. Your grandfather would be ashamed. I didn't answer. I folded a dish towel in thirds and wiped the counter. The lavender needed turning toward the light. I did that slowly, thumb under the edge of the pot, rotating half an inch until the stem leaned naturally. Thomas forwarded a letter from the family attorney. A neutral tone clipped phrasing. It used words like realignment and historical expectation. I forwarded it to Emily and didn't open the attachment. She replied the next day with handled. You don't need to respond. At work, a man named Carlos brought donuts every Friday. He placed them in the break room with a post-it, take 2. You earned them. He called me Audrey. Always Audrey. Once during a group call, someone called me ma'am. I corrected it gently. It's just Audrey. No one argued. I wrote in the notebook every night. Not reflections, just facts. Cut my own hair today. Not perfect, but neat. Made lentil soup. Tastes better the next day. Read 3 pages without checking the clock. There was a kind of relief in measuring days by effort instead of outcome. One night, the apartment upstairs had people over. Muffled laughter, the sound of something dropped, then applause. I didn't mind. I opened the window and let the noise mix with the breeze. The lavender caught it, first tiny movements that reminded me of breath. I didn't have any photographs on the walls. I didn't need them. A letter came from the county clerk confirming the name change. A single sheet of paper embossed seal at the bottom. I placed it inside a folder labelled Self, then slid it into the drawer beside my passport and voter card. The handle stuck for a moment, then gave way with a small creak. The next day I called the credit union and asked to update the account name. The woman paused before confirming. New name matches the ID, right? It does. Okay, Audrey, you're all set. I hung up without checking the balance. The lavender bloomed by the 3rd week. Just one small spike of purple, tilted slightly. I didn't take a photo. I just looked. That night, I wrote one sentence in the notebook at the bottom of the page in the corner space that usually stayed blank. I no longer need anyone to confirm my worth. Then I closed the cover quietly, like folding a napkin. Letting go doesn't always sound like a decision. Sometimes it just stops echoing. The envelope wasn't thick enough to mean anything dramatic. I didn't even need a paperclip. Just 3 cleanly printed documents and 1 folded note in my handwriting. No return address. The lawyer would know. I had written my name at the top of each form, Audrey Callahan, and signed it underneath with the name that no longer belonged to them, Audrey Bennett. The first page revoked my name from every advisory board tied to the Callahan Foundation or its affiliated branches. The second formally relinquished all rights, claims, or promotional associations with the family's name, likeness, or brand. The third was just a forwarding notice. Any future inquiries, requests, or notices were to go through my attorney. The note, scrawled in black ink across recycled linen paper, read, "I have no remaining interest in any legacy you still claim. All current and future communication should be directed through legal counsel. No exceptions." I folded the letter so the signature disappeared first. When I sealed the envelope, I did it without haste. I licked the glue strip even though I had a sponge nearby. The taste was faintly chemical. I pressed the flap down flat, then ran a dry cloth across it as though to ensure the silence stayed inside. At the post office, I waited in line behind a man returning a broken toy truck and a woman arguing about her mailbox key. Neither looked around. No one ever does there. The clerk scanned the label and handed me the receipt without speaking. I folded it once then again and placed it behind the emergency card in my wallet. It stayed there. The second errand took longer. The Jefferson Avenue apartment had always been called mine, but it never really was. My father purchased it under a holding account for tax optimization. I had lived there briefly after graduate school, mostly during off-post transitions. No one else ever stayed long. I had kept the utilities in my name. I had paid the property taxes from my own account for the past 5 years. No one ever thanked me for that. I never expected them to. After I changed my name, I received a letter about back rent, unsigned, undated, and hand-delivered to the foundation office. The implication was clear now that I had walked away the door. They expected me to settle the ghost of something they never actually gave, so I sold it. There was no protest from the family, no legal contest. They hadn't realized the property had been quietly transferred to me Years ago, when I took over paying the Foundation's operational debts, my name had been added quietly, as if even the system recognized something they never did. I declined staging. The realtor asked if I wanted a statement of values left on the kitchen counter for buyers to see. No statements, I told her. It sold in less than 2 weeks. I requested that the wire transfer go directly into the account I had set up the month before, the Bennett Endowment for Female Military Scholars. Not flashy, just precise. I didn't call Emily to tell her. I didn't think she'd care. The day the sale closed, I walked to the bank. No coat, no folder. I only carried my ID and a confirmation slip with the transfer details printed in 10-point Arial. I'd like to initiate a donation transfer, I told the woman behind the glass. Entire amount. Her nails were short and unpainted. She typed slowly, glanced at me once. Full balance. Yes. Her fingers paused, then moved again. I signed 2 forms. She gave me a receipt. It wasn't printed in color. It didn't need to be. Outside, the wind tugged slightly at the sleeves of my sweater. I didn't tighten them. I let it pass through. Later that night, I found the old debit card in the back of a drawer. It was bent slightly with the edges worn soft. It had paid for so many things in silence. Foundation, galas, retirement ceremonies, even the emergency surgery my father insisted be kept quiet. The name on the card read, Audrey Callahan. I turned it over twice. The magnetic strip was still intact. I slid it across the counter once just to hear the scratch of plastic against formica. Then I picked up the kitchen scissors and placed the blade along the curve of the C. It sliced in one steady motion. The sound was not dramatic. The pieces lay still. I dropped them into the trash can beneath the sink and didn't look back. That night, I removed the last digital reminders. A shared folder titled Family Affairs, buried deep in my computer's archive. Photos from holidays I barely remembered. Correspondence I had only skimmed at the time. Password hints that no longer worked. I copied the folder to an external hard drive, then encrypted it. I placed it in the locked drawer beside the lavender seeds I hadn't yet planted. Some things don't need deleting. Just distance. A week later, a new debit card arrived in the mail. White envelope, no logo, just a string of numbers and a name printed cleanly, Audrey Bennett. I opened the envelope without ceremony and slid the card into the middle slot of my wallet next to the grocery store discount tag and the tiny note I had written to myself 2 months ago. You're allowed to be whole without proof. Thomas emailed again the following Tuesday. A terse subject line, please advise on next steps. I didn't open it. My attorney did. No one called me after that. I spent the evening trimming the dead edges of the lavender stalk and cleaning the kitchen sink with baking soda and lemon. The apartment smelled faintly of citrus and soil. I moved through the room slowly, not in mourning, not in celebration, just in clarity. I looked again at the empty slot in my wallet where the old card used to live. Nothing missing. I returned to my notebook and turned to the next page. The lines were straight, unmarked. I didn't write anything this time. I closed the cover, placed it under my hand and left it there. Not to weigh it down, just to feel that it was mine. Some things settle without ceremony. The towel folded neatly, edges aligned warm from the radiator where I'd left it to dry. I placed it on the counter without thought, the way I'd done every week since I moved in. Beside it sat the chamomile tea, still steaming faintly floral. The tea bag tag curled against the cup, its string damp from having slipped too far in. The oven hummed softly, not quite ready. On the table lay the things I never seemed to rush: a half-filled notebook, 2 unsnort postcards from the coast, and an envelope of lavender seeds I hadn't decided where to plant. I had time now. I opened the window just a little enough to let the breeze move through. The curtain lifted slightly. No urgency, no resistance. Outside, the grass had just been trimmed. The smell reached me slowly, like it wasn't sure I'd want to notice. A small thud below. The girl from across the hall was jumping rope again, her rhythm off arms, flailing laughter, unfiltered. I heard someone say, "You'll get it if you just stop thinking." The girl tried again. The rope caught. She laughed harder. I watched for a moment, then returned to my seat without comment. Later that afternoon, the envelope arrived. Cream-colored, no window. My name typed cleanly in the center. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. Emily Carter had called the week before to confirm it. Still, I took the time to open it carefully. No tearing, no rush. Inside, 3 pages clipped. One sentence stood out above the rest. Audrey Bennett, no longer attached to the liabilities of the Callahan Foundation in any legal capacity. I read it twice, then folded it once, and slid it behind the drawer divider with the utility bills and the recipe cards I never used. I didn't shred it. I didn't scan it. It didn't need to follow me. The following day, another envelope appeared, this one, handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. I recognized the loop in the M before I even lifted the flap. If you'd like, I'll attend the ceremony this time. Not for him. For you. Mom. No return address, no date, no mention of what was missing between then and now. I didn't place the card on the fridge or the shelf by the window. I didn't throw it away, either. I slid it gently into the drawer where I kept old bus passes and dried rosemary. It didn't sting. It simply didn't require a response. I made no plans for the ceremony. That evening, I stepped onto the small balcony. The lavender pot had grown uneven, one side fuller than the other, leaning slightly toward the light. I watered it slowly, letting the soil absorb in silence. Beside the pot, a wooden frame hung by twine. I had painted the sign one weekend in late spring with leftover acrylics and a steady hand. Built quietly. Lived fully. No signature, no branding. Just 5 words sealed in weatherproof varnish, fading a little at the corners. I stood there until the light changed on the buildings across the street. The tea inside had gone cold. I left it. The next morning I brewed a new cup. This time I used the loose leaf blend a neighbor had gifted me. It smelled slightly of lemon and something else I couldn't name. The water boiled gently, not rushing to completion. I poured steeped weighted. There was no mirror speech, no declaration. I sipped slowly, both hands around the cup. At some point, someone knocked on my door. "A parcel delivery, wrong address." I pointed them to the next unit. They nodded. Didn't ask my name. I liked that. That night, I pulled the notebook from the kitchen drawer. The lines were crisp, the pages smooth. I flipped past the ones already filled, dates, fragments, stray phrases that no longer needed polishing. On the last page, I wrote nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because the act of not writing it down meant it had already lived. I closed the cover gently and left it there beside the sink. In the corner of the room, a small light flickered from the lamp I'd rewired myself. The switch stuck a little imperfect, but functional. I kept it that way. A voicemail waited on my phone, from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't play it. I didn't delete it either. Some things are better left unconfirmed. That night, I reheated the tea, not because I needed warmth, but because it had waited for me. I stood at the window and watched the girl across the way trying to double dutch. Her rope tangled again. This time, no one corrected her. She tried again anyway. I pressed my palm to the cool glass and didn't speak. I didn't destroy my father. I simply stopped protecting the silence. I don't need to prove anything anymore because each morning when I make tea for myself, I know I'm living. And that is enough.